The scratch of the Mont Blanc pen against heavy cardstock was the first sound. The second was my father clearing his throat to demand $312,000 for the crime of raising me. We were sitting at a high-end steakhouse in Bellevue, Washington, on my 30th birthday. He did not blink as he slid a printed spreadsheet across the white linen tablecloth. It detailed every dollar he had spent on my food, shelter, and basic survival since the day I was born. I looked at the itemized charges for my childhood. I looked at my mother, who was staring at her wine glass, pretending this was perfectly normal. I did not cry. Instead, I reached into my leather bag, pulled out a black binder, and slid my own invoice across the table. A demand for $480,000 covering a decade of therapy bills and a stolen trust fund. My mother took a sharp breath and choked on her Merlot. The dark red wine splattered across the pristine tablecloth. I stood up and told him my lawyer was waiting for his call. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his entire fake empire, please take a second to hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family. Drop a comment and tell me your age and where you are listening from. You are tuning into Savage Revenge Stories. My name is Pearl George. I am 30 years old. Now let me take you back to the beginning of that birthday dinner, the night the illusion finally shattered. I arrived at Daniel's Broiler 10 minutes early. The rain was coming down in sheets over Lake Washington, smearing the city lights into a gray blur. I sat in my Volvo for a moment, listening to the steady beat of the windshield wipers. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Every year, my birthday dinner felt less like a celebration and more like an annual performance review. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my tailored blazer, and walked inside. The restaurant was the kind of place where the lighting is kept low enough to obscure the menu prices, and the patrons wear designer vests like corporate armor. The air smelled of seared ribeye and expensive cologne. The hostess led me to a corner booth. Richard, my father, sat on one side in a charcoal suit. He had the posture of a man preparing to close a hostile takeover. Helen, my mother, sat beside him wearing a silk scarf and focusing her eyes on the salt shaker. He did not stand when I reached the table. He simply tapped his watch. "Right on time, Pearl," he said. "Have a seat." We ordered. We exchanged the usual hollow pleasantries. He asked about my firm. I told him my work as a senior forensic accountant was keeping me busy. Tracking hidden assets and unraveling financial fraud for corporate clients was my native language. I spent my days finding the exact places where greedy people tried to hide their sins. My father nodded, sipping his bourbon. He always respected the title, but he never respected the person holding it. When the waiter cleared our plates, Richard reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a manila folder and placed it squarely between us. He folded his hands over his empty rocks glass. "What is this?" I asked. "An itemized ledger," Richard said. His tone was casual. It was the same voice he used to negotiate commercial real estate leases. "We have spent 3 decades investing in your potential, Pearl. Now that you are a successful auditor, it is time to settle the balance." I opened the folder. The spreadsheet inside was printed on crisp, watermarked paper. 3 columns lined the page: date, expense, category, amount. My eyes scanned the rows. The dates trace back to my infancy. Housing allocation, $84,000. Nutritional provision, $42,000. Educational guidance and extracurricular transport, $61,000. Health insurance premiums, $28,000. At the bottom, a bolded total sat waiting for me, $312,000. My chest tightened. The air in the restaurant suddenly felt too thin to breathe. 30 years of surviving a man who viewed his family as a corporate hierarchy had taught me one critical survival tactic: never show a deficit. Never let him see you bleed. "You are invoicing me for groceries," I said. My voice held steady, but I could feel my pulse beating in my throat. "I am establishing a return on investment," Richard corrected. He adjusted his silver cufflinks. "You recently decided to halt contributions to your mother's medical fund. He meant her country club dues. I had cut off the $1,200 monthly wire transfer 6 weeks ago. I stopped paying when I audited the routing numbers and realized the Bellevue Wellness Clinic she claimed to visit was actually a disguised billing shell for an exclusive golf resort. When I confronted her, she told me it was for her mental health. I told her my bank account was no longer her personal pharmacy. This is a legally binding demand for repayment. Richard continued leaning back against the leather booth. I expect a structured payment plan by Monday morning. Family loyalty goes both ways, Pearl. You do not get to walk away from your debts. I looked at Helen. She still refused to meet my eyes. Her manicured thumb traced the rim of her wineglass in a slow, nervous circle. She was the peacekeeper, the woman who traded her own voice for the comfort of a Bellevue zip code. She knew exactly what was in that folder. She had likely proofread the columns to ensure the math was correct. I sat there staring at the manila folder. Memories flashed through my mind. I remembered being 12 years old and having to sign a contract to earn my allowance. I remembered sweeping the garage for 3 hours, only for him to deduct $1 because I missed a corner. I remembered the feeling of always owing him something just for taking up space in his house. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to match the suffocating pressure in my chest. The restaurant hummed around us. Silverware clattered against china. Tech executives murmured about stock options 2 tables over. None of them knew a father was currently trying to extort his own daughter over a prime cut of beef. I closed his manila folder. I reached down to my leather tote resting on the floor. My fingers found the cool, smooth surface of a black presentation binder. I had spent the last 3 weeks preparing this exact document. I lifted it and set it on the table. I pushed it across the white linen until it touched his folder. "What is this?" Richard asked. A faint crease appeared between his brows. His script was unraveling. "My counter invoice," I replied. He picked it up and opened the cover. The top page mirrored his formatting perfectly. Date, expense, category, amount. Emotional regulation outsourcing spanning 2014 to 2026, $68,000 for therapy. Unpaid administrative labor representing household management from ages 10 to 18, $52,000. Punitive damages for projected inheritance theft, $360,000. The grand total was $480,000. Helen took a sharp breath, inhaling a sip of Merlot, just as her eyes caught the bottom line. She choked. A crimson drop splattered onto the pristine white tablecloth, spreading outward like a sudden injury. She coughed into a linen napkin, her eyes watering as she struggled for air. Richard's jaw tightened. The smug certainty drained from his features, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. The veins in his neck pressed against his stiff, white collar. "You think this is a joke?" he asked. His voice dropped an octave, carrying a sharp edge of warning. "I think it is an audit," I said. I stood up and retrieved my wool coat from the back of the chair. I slid my arms into the sleeves. I looked down at the man who had turned my childhood into a balance sheet. "I have Sarah Sterling on retainer," I said. "Send your $312,000 bill to her office. She handles all my fraud claims." Richard did not say a word. He just stared at the open binder, the number 480,000 glaring back at him. I turned away from the table. My heels struck the hardwood floor in a steady, measured rhythm. I did not look back. I walked past the host stand and out the heavy glass doors into the cool Washington night. The rain was still falling, washing the pavement clean. I had left them sitting in the dim light, staring at the cost of losing me. I reached my car and pulled out my phone. The screen was already glowing with an incoming call from my mother. The fallout had begun, but I was not going to be the one paying for it anymore. The cold air hit my face the moment the heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung shut behind me. I walked quickly across the wet asphalt of the parking lot, finding my Volvo sitting quietly in the back row. Once inside, I locked the doors and gripped the leather steering wheel. The material felt freezing beneath my palms. I pressed the ignition button. The engine purred to life, sending a faint vibration through the floorboards. I merged onto Interstate 405 South and then took the long, curving ramp for the 520 floating bridge toward Seattle. The rain had picked up, turning into a steady, relentless Washington downpour. The windshield wipers swept back and forth across the glass. Thwap, 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 thwap. The rhythm was hypnotic, a mechanical metronome marking the first few minutes of my new reality. Below the bridge, the dark waters of Lake Washington churned, unseen in the night. Ahead, the Seattle skyline glowed like a scattered handful of embers, struggling against the fog. To my right, the passenger seat was empty, save for my purse, where my phone was currently vibrating against the leather lining. My chest hurt. It was not a metaphor. The pain was a sharp, physical ache radiating from my sternum up into my throat. For 30 years, my body had been wired with a single overriding directive: keep the peace, survive the boardroom of my family by apologizing for things I did not do. Every cell in my nervous system was currently screaming at me to take the next exit. Turn the car around, drive back to Bellevue, walk into that dim, high-end steakhouse, pull up a chair, and beg for forgiveness. The urge was so strong it made my hands shake against the steering wheel. I could almost hear the apology forming on my tongue. I am sorry, Richard. I overreacted. Let us figure this out. My brain, trained by decades of emotional extortion, began offering rationalizations. Maybe the invoice was just a harsh lesson in financial literacy. Maybe I should have just paid the country club fees for one more month. The trauma bond was a parasite trying to convince the host to stay in the cage. I pressed my foot down harder on the accelerator. The speedometer needle climbed. I had to force my eyes to stay focused on the red taillights of a semi-truck a quarter-mile ahead, using it as an anchor. The hardest part of escaping an abuser is not the initial confrontation. It is surviving the silent drive home when your own mind tries to betray you. I rolled the window down an inch, letting the freezing rain spray against my cheek. The sudden sting of the cold water grounded me. To understand the gravity of walking out of that restaurant, you have to understand the architect of my childhood. Richard George did not view himself as a father. He saw himself as the chief executive officer of a domestic enterprise. He ran our household with the same cold, calculating metrics he applied to his commercial real estate firm. Every piano lesson was a capital investment. Every straight-A report card was an expected quarterly dividend. And I was the entry-level employee who was never allowed to clock out. His obsession with control was born from a very specific terror. His own father, my grandfather, had been a charming but reckless man who gambled away a modest fortune and died bankrupt in a rented room in Tacoma. Richard was 18 when the eviction notice was pinned to their front door. He spent his entire adult life outrunning the ghost of that poverty. He clawed his way into the Bellevue Country Club scene, marrying my mother because her pedigree looked good on an application. He built an empire of appearances. But an empire built on the fear of poverty requires constant tribute. He demanded absolute loyalty, and he enforced it through financial terror. If you strayed from his vision, he cut the funding. He froze the accounts. He sent an invoice. My mother, Helen, was his eager accomplice. She served as the vice president of public relations for his fake empire. Her job was to smooth over his cruelty by calling it discipline. When he demanded I pay rent at age 16 from my after-school job, Helen told me it was building character. When he skipped my graduation to play golf, Helen told me he was securing our future. She traded her protective instincts for a sprawling house and a platinum credit card. My phone buzzed again, illuminating the dark interior of the car. The screen displayed Helen calling. It was the 8th missed call in 12 minutes. I reached over and tapped the screen to decline. A moment later, the tiny voicemail icon appeared. Then the red number beside it ticked up to 9. Then 10. Then 12. I kept my eyes on the road, navigating the slick asphalt as the bridge gave way to the busy city streets of Seattle. The neon signs of Capitol Hill reflected bright colors in the deep puddles along the curb. I pulled over onto a quiet residential side street, put the car in park, and picked up the device. 14 voicemails sat in the queue, all from my mother. I did not need to press play to know the script. I had heard it 1,000 times before. The first few messages would be frantic. "Pearl, please come back. He is furious." The middle messages would pivot to guilt. "How could you ruin your own birthday dinner? Think of my blood pressure." The final messages would be the raw, unfiltered manipulation. "You are destroying this family over a misunderstanding." My thumb hovered over the first message. The deep-rooted conditioning whispered to me to listen. Just hear her out. Maybe she is crying. Maybe she finally understands. I took a slow breath, inhaling the scent of damp wool from my winter coat. I tapped the edit button in the corner of the screen. I selected the first voicemail, then the second. I moved down the list methodically, checking the empty circles next to each timestamp. 3, 4, 5. The rhythmic thwap, thwap of the windshield wipers was the only sound filling the cabin of the car. 10, 11, 12. I selected all 14. I pressed delete. The screen cleared. The digital weight of her panic vanished into the ether. I held the power button down on the side of the device. A prompt appeared, asking to slide to power off. I swiped my finger across the cool glass. The screen went black. The silence that followed was profound. It felt like the first true breath I had taken in 3 decades. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the street, heading toward the sanctuary of my downtown apartment. I knew the quiet would not last. Richard was not a man who accepted a loss of control. He would view my silence as an act of corporate treason. By morning, he would deploy his most reliable asset to break my resolve. My younger sister, Clara, the golden child of the George family enterprise. She was currently living entirely on his payroll. When Richard wanted to punish me, he always squeezed her, knowing she would come hunting for me. The war had only just begun. The morning sun was a pale gray filter over the Seattle skyline, casting long, weak shadows across the hardwood floor of my apartment. I stood in the kitchen watching the coffee maker drip dark liquid into a ceramic mug. The silence in the room was a heavy, physical thing. It was the kind of quiet that follows a seismic event. I had kept my phone powered off all night. I slept for exactly 3 hours, waking up every time the wind rattled the window panes, expecting to see my father's name glowing on a screen in the dark. But the screen remained black. I was safe in my own sanctuary. Then the building intercom buzzed. It was not a polite single press. It was a frantic, rapid-fire staccato of sound that pierced the quiet like a drill. The noise sent an immediate spike of adrenaline straight into my chest. I walked to the digital panel near the front door and tapped the camera feed. 2 figures stood in the lobby, my younger sister Clara and her husband, Todd. Clara was pacing in tight circles. Todd was staring directly into the security lens, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. They did not buzz again. They just waited, knowing I could see them. I pressed the unlock button. A minute later, a sharp, rapid knock echoed against my front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Clara pushed past me before the hinges even stopped moving. Todd followed close behind, bringing the heavy scent of expensive sandalwood cologne and underlying sweat into my hallway. "Pearl, you need to fix this right now," Clara said. Her voice was shrill, vibrating with a frantic energy. I closed the door, leaning my back against the cool wood. I looked at my younger sister. Clara was the golden child of the George family enterprise. She was the daughter who followed the blueprint flawlessly. She went to the right college, joined the approved sorority, and married the man with the most promising pitch deck. In return, Richard rewarded her with a sprawling house in Medina, a luxury SUV, and a platinum supplementary credit card tied directly to his primary account. She was the compliant employee, and she had been handsomely compensated for her obedience. But right now, the golden child was unraveling. Her flawless blowout was slightly frizzy from the morning rain. Her eyes were wide and rimmed with red. Fix what, Clara? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. My card declined at the gas station, she practically shouted. She raised her arms in a gesture of absolute disbelief. I was at the pump on Bellevue Way. The attendant had to come out and tell me the transaction was rejected. I had to call Todd to come pay for a tank of premium fuel. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? He froze my accounts, Pearl. Dad cut off my card because of you. She dropped her arms, and that was when I noticed her hands. Clara was gripping a dark quilted leather designer handbag. The bag cost at least $6,000. It was an accessory meant to signal effortless wealth. But her perfectly manicured fingers were trembling violently against the soft leather. Her knuckles were bone white. She was clutching a small fortune in her hands while simultaneously spiraling into panic because she could not afford to put gas in her car. The juxtaposition was staggering. He did not cut off your card because of me, I replied. He cut off your card because it belongs to him. That is how his money works, Clara. It is a leash. Todd stepped forward, positioning himself between me and his wife. He wore the standard uniform of a Pacific Northwest tech founder, a high-end fleece vest over a tailored button-down shirt, and pristine, minimal sneakers. Todd ran a software startup that was perpetually chasing its Series A funding round. He always projected an aura of casual dominance, but today his neck was flushed a deep, angry red. "Do not psychoanalyze us," Pearl Todd commanded. His voice held the practiced authority of a man used to giving orders to junior developers. "Richard is furious. You humiliated him in public at your birthday dinner. You walked out and handed him some ridiculous fake invoice. Now he is taking it out on our household to prove a point. You are going to pick up your phone, call your father, apologize for your little stunt, and get him to lift the freeze on our accounts." I stared at Todd. My mind shifted gears, transitioning out of the role of the traumatized daughter and into the sterile, analytical space of a forensic auditor. I watched the rapid pulse beating at the base of Todd's throat. I noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. Clara missing a spa day or being embarrassed at a gas station did not warrant this level of aggressive panic from Todd. Clara was spoiled, but Todd was a businessman. He was acting like a cornered animal. "Why are you sweating, Todd?" I asked. "I am not sweating," he snapped, crossing his arms over his chest. "I am losing patience with your selfish behavior. We have bridging loans pending. We cannot afford a cash flow disruption right now. Our investors expect stability." The words hung in the air. Bridging loans. Cash flow disruption. My analytical brain locked onto the discrepancy immediately. Why would a tech startup founder with supposed venture capital backing care if his father-in-law froze a personal supplementary credit card? The math did not align. Unless Todd was not relying on venture capital at all. Unless Todd was secretly using Richard's credit lines to make payroll and keep a failing company afloat. A new theory began to assemble itself in my mind. A red herring dragging itself across the pristine surface of my family history. What if Richard was not just being vindictive? What if Richard handed me an invoice for $312,000 because Todd had already drained the George family coffers? If Todd had bled my father dry, it would explain why Richard was suddenly desperate enough to try and extort his estranged daughter for cash. "I am not calling him," I said, "and I am certainly not apologizing." Todd's posture changed. The polished tech bro facade vanished entirely. He took a heavy step toward me, invading my personal space. He loomed over me, using his height to try and force a physical intimidation tactic that he probably used in boardrooms. "You are going to fix this," Pearl Todd growled. "You do not get to blow up the family dynamic and leave us to deal with the shrapnel. I have real responsibilities. I have employees. I will not let your daddy issues bankrupt my company." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked up directly into his angry, flushed face. "You are in my house, Todd," I said. My voice was quiet, but the absolute coldness in my tone made him freeze. "Step back from me right now, or I will have building security physically drag you out to the sidewalk." Todd blinked. The certainty wavered in his eyes. He slowly took a half step back, recognizing that his corporate bullying tactics held zero currency in my apartment. Clara let out a wet, ragged sob. She stepped around her husband and looked at me with an expression of pure betrayal. "You are destroying this family, Pearl. You have always been so selfish. You only care about yourself." "I am not destroying the family, Clara," I replied. "I am just refusing to fund it." I reached behind me, turned the brass knob, and pulled my front door wide open. The hallway outside was empty and quiet. I gestured toward the elevator. "Get out," I said, "both of you. And Todd, a piece of free financial advice. If your startup relies on a stolen credit card to survive, you do not have a company. You have a Ponzi scheme." Todd's jaw muscles flexed violently, but he did not speak. He grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her toward the exit. Clara stumbled slightly, her $6,000 handbag swinging against her hip, as she let out one final, dramatic wail. They crossed the threshold and marched down the carpeted hallway toward the elevators. I did not wait for the doors to close. I shut my front door and engaged the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. I stood alone in my entryway, breathing in the lingering scent of Todd's heavy cologne. My heart was racing, but my mind was crystal clear. The visit had been designed to break my resolve, but it had done the exact opposite. It had given me a loose thread. If Richard was financially squeezing Clara and Todd was panicked about insolvency, it meant the George family cash flow had a massive structural leak. The illusion of my father's endless wealth was cracking. If I wanted to protect myself from his legal threats, I needed to know exactly how deep his financial rot went. My father thought he was dealing with an obedient daughter. He forgot he was dealing with an auditor. It was time to run a deep dive background check on my own bloodline. The metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed in the narrow entryway of my apartment. I stood alone, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The scent of expensive sandalwood cologne still lingered in the air, a sharp reminder of the panic that had just invaded my sanctuary. I walked over to the counter and poured the dark coffee I had abandoned earlier that morning. It was lukewarm and bitter against my tongue. I carried the mug down the short hallway and stepped into my home office. My workspace was deliberately sparse: a solid oak desk, a dual monitor setup, and a locked filing cabinet. This was where I dissected corporate fraud for a living. I spent my days hunting hidden assets and untangling the financial lies of corrupt executives. Today, the subject of my audit was my own bloodline. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and woke the computer. The screens flickered to life, casting a cool blue glow across the quiet room. My mind was already categorizing the variables Todd had accidentally handed me. Tech founders who rely on actual venture capital do not hyperventilate over a canceled personal credit card. They lose their composure when their shadow funding evaporates. Richard demanding a six-figure check on my birthday was not a simple power play. It was a calculated distress signal. I opened my secure browser. As a forensic accountant, I know the primary rule of hunting hidden liabilities. You rarely look at the money directly. You look at the empty spaces the money leaves behind. I started with the most obvious target: myself. I logged into my professional portals and pulled my personal credit reports from all three major bureaus: Experian, TransUnion, Equifax. The encrypted pages loaded instantly, displaying a flawless financial history, 0 derogatory marks, 0 unexplained inquiries. My credit score hovered near perfect. I had placed a permanent security freeze on my Social Security number the week I turned 18. I executed that freeze because Richard had once tried to claim my summer internship earnings as household revenue to offset his own taxes. I knew early on that he viewed my assets as an extension of his own wallet. If my personal credit was locked down securely, how was he monetizing my existence? Why was he billing me for raising me if he was supposedly rich enough to fund Clara's lavish lifestyle? I leaned back, sipping the cold coffee. My eyes traced the grain of the wooden desk. If a predator cannot breach the reinforced front door, they build a quiet side entrance. I navigated away from the consumer credit bureaus and accessed the Washington Secretary of State Corporate Registry. Commercial databases operate by different rules. They do not track breathing people. They track legal entities. I typed my father's name into the search bar, Richard George. The results populated exactly as expected. His primary real estate brokerage, his various property holding companies, and a few dormant joint ventures. Nothing irregular appeared on the surface. I cleared the search field. I typed in my own name, Pearl George. The system returned a dozen generic results: a florist in Spokane, a freelance graphic designer in Tacoma. I refined the search parameters, filtering the data by addresses historically associated with my family. The Bellevue House, the old summer cabin we sold a decade ago, Richard's downtown office suite. The screen refreshed. A single row of corporate data appeared. Pearl G. Holdings, LLC. My breath hitched in my throat. I set the coffee mug down so quickly dark liquid splashed over the rim, staining a yellow legal pad. I moved the cursor over the blue hyperlink and clicked. The corporate filings expanded across my right monitor. The entity was formed 10 years ago. The registered address was a commercial mail drop located 2 miles from my parents' house. The nature of the business was listed vaguely as private asset management. I pulled the original formation documents. The puzzle pieces snapped into a horrifying alignment. Richard had not used my Social Security number to open the business lines of credit. He had applied to the federal government for an employer identification number. An EIN functions as a corporate equivalent of a personal Social Security digit. By naming the shell company after me and associating it with familiar regional addresses, he created a parallel financial identity, a ghost version of Pearl George that he controlled entirely. He had been using my shadow identity as a slush fund for a decade. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Using my high-level professional credentials, I accessed a commercial credit database to pull the financial footprint of Pearl G. Holdings. The ledger downloaded in seconds. I opened the spreadsheet and began scrolling through the transaction history. It was a masterclass in parasitic finance. Richard had opened multiple high-yield corporate credit cards and short-term business loans under the LLC. He used the cash to float his lifestyle, keeping the debt off his personal balance sheet. This protected his wealthy country club image while slowly building a toxic mountain of hidden liabilities in my name. I watched the line items blur past. Luxury car leases, expensive dinners at exclusive Seattle restaurants, first-class flights to international real estate conferences. He was funding his arrogance by borrowing against my ghost. But the commercial accounts were now in severe distress. The spreadsheet showed missed minimum payments beginning 8 months ago. Delinquency notices were piling up. The corporate creditors were closing in. That was why Clara had her card declined at the gas station. Richard was out of other people's money. The George family empire was running on fumes and empty promises. I kept scrolling backward through the ledger, tracing the rot to its earliest roots. My eyes scanned hundreds of rows of data until they stopped on a specific entry from June of 2014. The date sent a cold electric shock through my nervous system. I stared at the glowing laptop screen. The entry read, Bandon Dunes Golf Resort. The charge was for $400. June 2014, the exact afternoon of my high school graduation. The sensory memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I remembered sitting in the stuffy high school gymnasium wearing my stiff blue cap and gown. I remembered the smell of industrial floor wax and nervous teenage sweat. I remembered scanning the crowded wooden bleachers searching for my father. Helen sat alone in the third row, saving an empty metal folding chair beside her. She told me Richard was trapped in a critical merger meeting. She said he was working tirelessly to secure my college tuition. She told me to be grateful for his sacrifice, because men like him carried the weight of the world. He was not in a corporate boardroom. He was on the ninth hole of a luxury golf course on the Oregon coast, paying for his green fees with a credit card issued in my stolen name. My hands dropped from the keyboard. The blue light from the monitor reflected in the dark glass of my office window. For a long moment, I did not move. The profound depth of his betrayal was not just financial, it was deeply intimate. He had monetized my milestones. He had turned his absence as a father into a tax write-off. A hot, tight sensation gripped my chest. It was not sorrow. It was the sharp, precise focus of a predator recognizing its prey. I pressed the print command. The laser printer in the corner of the room hummed to life, spitting out pages of corporate filings and transaction histories. The warm sheets of paper piled up in the output tray. I gathered them, assembling a tangible, irrefutable record of his crimes. As I aligned the edges of the paper, I noticed a specific detail on the final page of the LLC formation packet: the signature block. Richard had signed as the managing member. But creating a corporate entity required a registered agent. A registered agent is someone who officially accepts legal documents on behalf of the company, a neutral third party required by the state to legitimize the structure. I stared at the secondary signature resting on the bottom line. The cursive was elegant, sloping slightly to the right. It was a signature I had seen on every birthday card and school permission slip of my childhood. Helen George. My mother had not just looked the other way while my father ruled the house. She had signed the foundational paperwork for his fraud. She was the registered agent of my financial abuse. My smartphone, sitting on the edge of the desk, vibrated against the wood. I had turned it back on an hour ago to check my work emails, expecting mostly silence. The caller ID illuminated the dim room. It was Helen. She was likely calling to play the peacemaker following the disastrous morning visit from Clara and Todd. She wanted to invite me to coffee. She wanted to smooth over the rough edges of her husband's extortion attempt with soft words and forced smiles. She wanted to keep the peace. I picked up the device. I did not decline the call this time. I let it ring twice more, memorizing the elegant, treacherous signature on the paper in my hand. Then I swiped the green icon and brought the speaker to my ear, ready to meet the woman who had helped sell my ghost. I answered the call. Her voice flowed through the tiny speaker, soft and practiced. It was the exact melodic tone she deployed when mediating disputes over country club seating arrangements or silencing my sister during a tantrum. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply stated she was already downtown shopping near my accounting firm and suggested we meet for a quick latte. It was a classic ambush, dressed up as a casual coincidence. I told her I would be at the espresso bar on 4th Avenue in 15 minutes. I ended the call without waiting for her goodbye. I took the warm stack of paper from the printer tray, the corporate filings, the transaction history, and the forged signature page. I slid the entire stack into a stiff leather folio and grabbed my trench coat. The coffee shop was a minimalist cavern of polished concrete and reclaimed wood. The air smelled sharply of roasted beans and damp wool from the coats of Seattle tech workers escaping the midday drizzle. The ambient noise was a steady hum of grinding espresso machines and low murmured conversations. I spotted my mother immediately. Helen George did not blend into Seattle coffee shops. She looked like she had been imported from a different tax bracket. She sat in a velvet corner booth facing the door. She wore a tailored cream cashmere sweater that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A patterned Hermes silk scarf was draped elegantly around her neck. Her blonde hair was arranged in a flawless blowout, defying the humid coastal weather outside. She looked immaculate. She looked curated. I walked over and slid into the wooden chair opposite her booth. She pushed a ceramic cup toward me across the small marble table. "I ordered you a flat white," she said. "Your favorite." "I drink black coffee now," I replied, pushing the cup back to the center of the table. "I have, for 5 years." Helen offered a tight, brittle smile. She folded her hands in her lap. The opening pleasantries were over. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to create an artificial bubble of intimacy between us. "Your father is under a tremendous amount of strain right now, Pearl," she began. Her eyes grew wide, shining with unshed tears. It was a performance worthy of an audience. The commercial real estate market is shifting. His investors are demanding higher yields. He is carrying the weight of this entire family on his shoulders, and he just wants to feel respected. I sat perfectly still. I watched the fake tears pool in the corners of her eyes. She was asking me to empathize with the man who had stolen my identity. "You humiliated him at the restaurant," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Walking out like that, throwing a binder in his face. It broke his heart. We gave you everything. We provided a beautiful life, and you treated him like a stranger." I let her talk. I let the gaslighting wash over me, observing the mechanics of her manipulation. "I know you are upset about the invoice," she whispered, reaching across the table to hover her hand near mine. "But he was just trying to teach you the value of $1. He wants you to understand the sacrifices we made. You do not have to pay the whole amount right now. Just write a small check. $50,000. Just a gesture of good faith to soothe his pride. It will calm him down, and we can all go back to normal." She wanted $50,000 to soothe the pride of a man who had secretly funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through a ghost corporation bearing my name. I unclasped the metal button on my leather folio. I withdrew the stack of corporate filings. I placed the papers face up on the marble table right next to her untouched latte. "I want you to look at this," I said. Helen glanced down. Her eyes scanned the bold black ink at the top of the page. Pearl G. Holdings, LLC. I watched her face closely, waiting for the shock. I waited for the confusion, the denial, the sudden horror of a mother realizing her husband had committed federal wire fraud against their child. Nothing happened. Her breathing did not change. Her pulse did not flutter. She did not gasp or ask what the document meant. Instead, she looked away. She shifted her gaze out the rain-streaked window, watching the city buses crawl through the wet streets. "You knew," I said. The realization was a cold stone dropping into the pit of my stomach. "You knew about the shell company. You knew he cloned my identity." "We did what we had to do to maintain our position," she murmured, still refusing to look at me. "The lifestyle you grew up enjoying was not free, Pearl." A brief memory surfaced in my mind, piecing together the tragedy of the woman sitting across from me. When I was a young girl, I found a dusty cardboard tube in the attic of our Bellevue home. Inside were intricate, beautiful architectural blueprints. Hand-drawn elevations of modern glass houses and sprawling civic centers. They belonged to Helen. At 22 years old, she had been the top student in the University of Washington architecture program. She used to have charcoal smudged on her fingertips. She had a brilliant, capable mind. But Richard demanded a traditional wife. He needed a pristine society hostess to erase the lingering shame of his own father's bankruptcy. He needed someone to manage the country club dinners and coordinate the charity galas. Helen traded her drafting tables for velvet cages. She abandoned her degree and allowed herself to become a decorative fixture in his empire. Over the decades, she became addicted to the ease of that wealth. When the money started running dry, she could have walked away. She could have reclaimed her autonomy. Instead, she chose to protect her luxury. She allowed her own daughter's financial future to be harvested, just so she could keep her cashmere sweaters and her standing weekly spa appointments. She was a victim who had slowly metamorphosed into a parasite. I reached across the table and tapped the final page of the LLC packet, the signature block. "You did not just look the other way," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are the registered agent. You signed the foundational paperwork. You helped him steal my ghost." Helen finally turned her head to look at me. The brittle mask was cracking. She swallowed hard. Her hand fluttered up to her throat. Her manicured fingers carefully, almost mechanically adjusted the Hermes silk scarf, trying to hide the nervous movement of her throat. "You do not understand how hard it is to keep this family afloat," she whispered defensively. I picked up my leather folio, leaving the damning printed documents sitting next to her coffee cup. I stood up from the wooden chair, looking down at the architect who had built her own prison. "You did not raise a daughter," I said. "You raised a credit score." I turned and walked toward the exit of the coffee shop, leaving her sitting alone with the evidence of her betrayal. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped back out into the Seattle rain. My heart was pounding with a dangerous new rhythm. The informal negotiations were over. My parents were not just toxic. They were active financial predators. Confronting them with facts would not stop them because they felt entirely justified in their theft. If I wanted to survive the coming war, I could no longer fight them alone. I needed someone who specialized in burning fake empires to the ground. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the number for Sarah Sterling. It was time to build a legal shield. The elevator climbed 40 stories above the Seattle streets. My ears popped as the steel box shot upward, leaving the damp pavement and the memory of my mother far below. The doors parted with a soft chime, revealing the reception area of Sterling and Cole. The walls were clad in dark walnut and frosted glass, projecting an aura of expensive intimidation. This was not a firm that handled simple divorces or parking tickets. They specialized in high-stakes financial litigation and white-collar defense. I walked past the receptionist and straight into the glass-walled conference room at the end of the corridor. Sarah Sterling was already waiting. Sarah was a former federal prosecutor who traded government wages for private sector billing rates about a decade ago. She wore a slate gray suit and kept her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot. She did not waste time with pleasantries or sympathetic head tilts. She operated strictly in facts, statutes, and leverage. That was exactly why I hired her. I did not need a therapist. I needed a mercenary. "Have a seat, Pearl," she said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite her. She pushed a glass of sparkling water across the polished mahogany table. "Tell me why you called me on a Tuesday afternoon, sounding like you just found a body." I sat down and placed my leather folio on the table. I unclasped the button and slid the stack of papers toward her. The corporate filings for Pearl G. Holdings, LLC. The transaction histories. The forged registered agent signature. "I did not find a body," I replied. "I found a ghost." Sarah picked up the documents. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the faint patter of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Seattle sprawled out beneath us, a grid of gray concrete and crawling traffic. I watched her eyes scan the pages. Her expression remained neutral, but her reading pace slowed as she reached the financial ledgers. She was a hunter, picking up a fresh scent. "Your father opened a parallel corporate entity using a modified employer identification number," Sarah stated. She did not phrase it as a question. She was confirming the mechanics of the crime. "Yes," I said. "He bypassed my personal credit freeze. He used the shell company to secure business loans and commercial credit lines. My mother is listed as the registered agent. They have been running their personal expenses through it for 10 years. The accounts are currently defaulting." Sarah set the papers down and leaned back, lacing her fingers together. "The legal implications are straightforward," she said. "We are looking at multiple counts of identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. If we take this to the authorities, your parents will face federal indictments. They will lose everything: the house, the cars, the country club memberships. They will trade Bellevue for a federal penitentiary. Are you prepared for that level of fallout?" I looked out the window at the storm clouds rolling in off the Puget Sound. A week ago, the thought of destroying my parents' lives would have paralyzed me. I would have folded inward, trying to figure out how to absorb their debt and save their reputation. I would have ironed the napkins and paid the bill. But the woman who used to do those things died at a steakhouse on her 30th birthday. "I am not here to protect them, Sarah," I said, meeting her gaze. "I am here to neutralize them. I want to transition from defense to offense. They think they can extort me for $300,000 because they assume I will fold under pressure. I want to hit them so hard they never ask me for a dime again." A sharp, approving smile touched the corners of Sarah's mouth. "Good," she said. "Let us dissect the ledger." She reached for her tablet, pulling up the digital files I had forwarded from the lobby. She mirrored her screen to the large monitor mounted on the conference room wall. Rows of spreadsheet data illuminated the room. We spent the next hour tracing the flow of stolen capital. Richard was sloppy. He treated the LLC like a personal piggy bank, mixing legitimate real estate write-offs with luxury car payments and expensive vacations. But as we moved deeper into the historical data, Sarah stopped scrolling. She frowned, leaning closer to her tablet screen. "Pearl, look at this," she said. I turned my attention to the monitor. She had isolated the transactions from the year 2014. The same year Richard skipped my high school graduation to play golf on the Oregon coast. The same year the credit lines were first established. Look at the initial capitalization of the LLC Sarah instructed. I studied the numbers. When a new corporate entity is formed, it requires seed money, a starting balance to secure the initial credit lines. I expected to see a transfer from Richard's primary business account. Instead, I saw a staggering cash deposit. $250,000 wired directly into the LLC on a Tuesday morning in early June. "Where did that come from?" I asked, my brow furrowing. I ran a cross-reference on his known assets. Richard did not have that kind of liquid cash sitting around in 2014. His commercial properties were over-leveraged. "Exactly," Sarah said. She picked up a silver stylus and tapped the glass screen of her tablet. She pulled up the corresponding tax return for the LLC from that specific year. The document materialized on the monitor. She slid the silver stylus across her tablet, tracing a line down the digital page. The metal tip made a faint clicking sound against the glass. She stopped at the section detailing the origin of capital contributions. She drew a slow, deliberate circle around a glaringly empty line. The tax origin was redacted. Missing. Erased. You do not just manifest $250,000 in untaxed cash without a paper trail, Sarah murmured, her eyes narrowing. And you certainly do not hide the origin unless the money itself is radioactive. This is not just a loan from a friend. This smells like an inheritance. An inheritance. I repeated the word, feeling foreign on my tongue. My family did not have generational wealth. My paternal grandfather died broke in Tacoma. My maternal grandparents were middle-class teachers who left their modest savings to a local charity. There was no secret fortune. Sarah tapped the stylus against her chin. Who handled your family's estate planning back then? Elias Thorne, I answered instantly. The name left a bitter taste in my mouth. Elias was a sleazy, high-society lawyer who frequented the same country club as my parents. He wore tailored suits that were slightly too loud and always treated me like an annoying intern whenever he visited our house for dinner parties. He managed all of Richard's contracts and property deeds. Sarah's eyes lit up with a dangerous, predatory gleam. Elias Thorne. I know him. He operates in the gray areas of probate law. If $250,000 materialized out of thin air and landed in a ghost corporation bearing your name, Elias Thorne drafted the paperwork to make it happen. The scope of the betrayal suddenly expanded. This was not just a father using his daughter's name to buy a golf trip. This was an organized conspiracy. Richard Helen and their estate lawyer had orchestrated a high-level financial heist. They had stolen something that belonged to me before I was even old enough to know it existed. "We are going to subpoena Elias Thorne," Sarah stated, typing rapidly into her tablet. "We are going to demand every piece of correspondence, every wire transfer record, and every trust document bearing your name from the last 15 years. We are going to shine a floodlight on their little shadow operation." "How long will that take?" I asked. "I can draft the initial cease and desist and discovery demands by tomorrow morning," she replied. "We will formally reject your father's ridiculous invoice and put him on notice that we are investigating the LLC. He will realize very quickly that his extortion attempt just handed us the keys to his locked financial closets." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. The anxiety was gone, replaced by the cold, hard calculus of an audit. I was ready to dismantle the empire. But Sarah paused, looking up from her screen. Her sharp features softened just a fraction. "You need to brace yourself, Pearl," she warned. "Your father is a cornered man." When a narcissist realizes they cannot bully you in private, they will try to destroy you in public. The moment he receives my letter, he will not fight us in a courtroom. He will fight you in the court of public opinion. He will try to burn your reputation to the ground before you can expose him. "Let him try," I said, standing up from the conference table. "I have spent 30 years caring about what people think. I do not care anymore." I left the law firm and stepped back out into the Seattle storm. The rain was washing the streets clean. I felt armored. I had my legal shield in place. I had a target. I was prepared for a financial war. But as I drove home through the dark city, I severely underestimated just how dirty Richard George was willing to fight to protect his fake crown. The battle was about to leave the spreadsheets and spill directly into the streets. The email from Sarah Sterling arrived in my inbox at exactly 9 in the morning on Thursday. It contained a single sentence. "The cease and desist, along with the discovery demands for Elias Thorne, have been served." I read the words while sipping my dark roast coffee. The legal shield was officially deployed. Richard now knew I was hunting the origin of the $250,000 shadow deposit. I expected an immediate reaction, a furious phone call, a threatening text, a demand for a sit-down negotiation. Instead, I received silence. For 48 hours, my phone did not ring. The quiet felt unnatural. It was the heavy, still atmosphere that precedes a sudden shift in barometric pressure. I should have known my father would not engage in a frontal assault. A man who builds a fake empire does not fight in the daylight. He fights in the shadows, using the currency he values most: reputation. The assault began digitally. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a forensic audit for a tech client, when my professional networking profile pinged with a new direct message. I clicked the notification icon. The sender was a senior partner at a local wealth management firm. He was a man who frequently played 18 holes with Richard at the Bellevue Country Club. "Pearl," the message read, "I heard the tragic news about your recent struggles. Please know that mental health is nothing to be ashamed of. Seeking professional help instead of lashing out at your family is the brave choice. We are all praying for your recovery." I stared at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Before I could process the sheer audacity of the note, a second message appeared. This one from the mother of a childhood friend. It echoed the exact same sentiment. A heartbreaking situation, a sudden psychological break, a desperate plea for me to stop putting my poor parents through such unnecessary agony. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The puzzle pieces rapidly fell into place. Richard was not hiding. He was spinning a masterclass in public relations. He knew he could not stop the legal subpoenas, so he deployed a preemptive strike against my credibility. If a whistleblower is deemed unstable, the whistle they blow sounds like a hallucination. He was telling the Bellevue elite that his eldest daughter had suffered a severe psychological collapse. He was painting himself as the tragic, wounded patriarch enduring the erratic demands of a greedy, unhinged child. By Friday afternoon, the digital whispers turned into a flood. Anonymous accounts left cryptic comments on my professional articles. Mutual acquaintances unfriended me across various platforms. My hometown was closing its ranks. The country club ecosystem was a fragile organism. It survived by protecting its own and rejecting any foreign body that threatened the established social order. I was no longer a respected auditor. I was an infected cell, and Richard had ordered the antibodies to attack. The digital freeze was meant to break my spirit, but the true weight of his campaign did not register until Saturday morning. I drove across the bridge to run an errand on the east side, picking up a specialty wine for a client gift. I stopped at an upscale grocery store near my old neighborhood. The market was a cathedral of organic produce and imported delicacies. The aisles smelled of fresh-cut eucalyptus and artisan cheeses. I navigated a small metal cart toward the dairy section, enjoying the anonymity of the weekend crowd. I stopped in front of the open-air refrigeration units, reaching for a carton of oat milk. The cold air rolled off the shelves, chilling the skin on my forearms. The mechanical hum of the condenser fans provided a steady, droning background noise. That is when I heard it. I tell you, it is just devastating. The poor man is aging 10 years a week. I paused, my hand still hovering near the cold cartons. I did not turn my head. I recognized the voice immediately. Sylvia Caldwell. She was the reigning chairwoman of the annual hospital gala and my mother's most frequent tennis partner. She stood one aisle over, separated from me by a low display of imported olive oils. She was speaking to another woman clad in pristine athletic wear. I heard she is demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars, Sylvia continued, her voice dropping into a theatrical stage whisper, just extorting them out of pure greed. Richard said she walked into a birthday dinner and started throwing things, a complete mental breakdown. After everything her father gave her, after the life they provided. It just proves you can buy them the best education in the world, but you cannot buy gratitude. The words cut through the low hum of the refrigeration unit like a surgical blade. The other woman offered a sympathetic clicking sound with her tongue, murmuring something about the tragedy of modern parenting. I stood frozen in the cold air. The grocery store around me seemed to blur. My chest constricted. It is one thing to read a condescending message on a computer screen. It is an entirely different experience to hear your character assassinated in the dairy aisle of the town you grew up in. Richard had orchestrated this. He sat in the leather chairs of the clubhouse, swirling his scotch, and fed them these lies, line by line. He weaponized the women who used to pinch my cheeks and praise my report cards. A familiar conditioning flared up in my throat. The urge to step around the olive oil display. The urge to confront Sylvia, to pull out my phone and show her the forged corporate documents. The desperate need to prove my sanity to an audience that had already convicted me. I wanted to scream the truth. I closed my eyes, focusing on the cold air sinking into my skin. I forced my breathing to slow. If I engaged, I would only prove Richard's fabricated narrative. An erratic confrontation in a grocery store was exactly what a person having a mental breakdown would do. The country club elite did not care about the truth. They cared about the performance of wealth and stability. Richard was one of their own. I was the threat. I grabbed the carton of oat milk and placed it gently into my cart. I stood up straight, adjusting the collar of my trench coat. I guided the cart around the end of the aisle, stepping directly into Sylvia's line of sight. She stopped speaking instantly. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her perfectly bronzed cheeks. She stood, clutching a jar of capers, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. I did not glare. I did not frown. I offered her a polite, tight smile, the exact same smile my mother used when someone spilled red wine on her carpets. "Good morning, Sylvia," I said. My tone was crisp and professional. "The gala planning must be keeping you busy." She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. She managed a weak, jerky nod. I did not wait for a response. I kept walking, pushing my cart toward the checkout lanes with measured, deliberate steps. I left her, standing in silence, holding her expensive capers and her cheap gossip. I paid for my items and carried the paper bag out to my Volvo. The moment I sat in the driver's seat, I locked the doors and let out a long, shaky breath. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make the leather creak. The isolation was profound. Richard was trying to starve me of my community. He wanted to surround me with a hostile ecosystem, hoping the sheer weight of the public rejection would force me to drop the subpoenas. He wanted me to feel so entirely alone that I would crawl back to his fake empire just to be allowed back in the warmth. I started the engine. The realization settled over me, solidifying my resolve into something unbreakable. The smear campaign was not a display of his power. It was a display of his sheer panic. He was throwing social rumors at me because he knew he could not survive the legal facts. He was out of ammunition in the real world, so he was fighting me in the court of country club opinion. Let them whisper, I thought, shifting the car into gear. Let them trade their rumors over organic kale and overpriced wine. They could keep their fragile social circle. I was going to take the entire foundation it was built on. But as I merged onto the highway back to Seattle, I knew the silence from Richard would not last. The social freeze was his first tactic. When he realized a few nasty messages and grocery store whispers were not enough to make me withdraw, the legal hunt he would have to escalate. He could not reach me emotionally, and he could not reach me legally. He would have to send a proxy to breach my physical sanctuary. He needed someone foolish enough to do his dirty work. He needed someone who was just as desperate for cash as he was. And by Monday morning, that desperate proxy would be standing in the lobby of my corporate accounting firm, ready to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, aggressive efficiency unique to downtown Seattle. The rain had cleared, leaving a sharp blue sky and sidewalks crowded with professionals clutching overpriced coffee. I walked into the soaring glass atrium of the Sterling Coal Building, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The lobby hummed with the quiet, expensive energy of corporate America. This was my terrain. I spent years navigating high-stakes audits and hostile boardrooms. The country club whispers of Bellevue felt a million miles away. I approached the security desk, scanning my badge, when a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. Pearl. The voice was loud, echoing sharply against the glass walls. I turned. Todd stood there. My brother-in-law was breathing heavily, his face flushed a mottled red. He wore a tailored navy suit that looked like it had been slept in. The usual tech bro confidence was entirely absent. He looked unraveled. He looked dangerous. "You are going to call off your attack dogs," Todd demanded, his voice rising above the ambient hum of the lobby. He ignored the startled glances of the attorneys and executives passing by. "Do you have any idea what you are doing to this family?" I stepped back, dislodging his hand from my shoulder. Todd was a man accustomed to getting his way through sheer volume. He ran a startup that hemorrhaged cash, but he maintained the illusion of success by bullying his junior developers and relying on Richard's stolen credit lines. Now the money tap was turning off, and he was panicking. "Keep your voice down, Todd," I said. My tone was flat, devoid of the emotion he was trying to provoke. "You are in a place of business." "I do not care about your business," he spat, taking another aggressive step into my personal space. "Richard received the letter from your lawyer. He cut us off completely, Pearl. He told Clara we have 30 days to vacate the Medina house unless you drop the subpoenas. You are making us homeless to settle some pathetic childhood vendetta." I watched the muscles in his jaw twitch. He was trying to publicly humiliate me, hoping the embarrassment of a scene would force me to capitulate. He assumed the old conditioning would kick in. He expected me to shrink, to apologize, to usher him into a private room to keep the peace. He miscalculated. "Your housing arrangement with my father is not my concern, Todd," I replied. I adjusted the strap of my leather tote. "If your company cannot afford to pay your mortgage, you should review your operating budget, not harass me in my lobby." Todd let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. He raised his arms, gesturing widely, drawing more attention from the growing crowd of onlookers. "You think you are so untouchable," he shouted, the veneer of civility completely shattering. "You think because you hired some fancy shark attorney, you can just bankrupt your own parents? You are sick, Pearl. The whole town knows you are having a mental breakdown. Richard was right about you. You are unstable. Drop the case today, or I swear to God I will make sure everyone in this building knows exactly how crazy you are." He was using Richard's exact script. The social smear campaign was bleeding into my physical reality. Todd wanted to make the threat visceral. He wanted me to feel the danger of isolation right here in the center of my professional world. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I looked at Todd, assessing the desperate, failing man standing before me. He was the ultimate red herring. I had initially suspected him of draining my father's accounts, but watching him melt down in a corporate lobby confirmed the truth. Todd was not a mastermind. He was just a parasite, panicking because the host was dying. Todd, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, deadly register, you are an adult man throwing a tantrum in a glass box. You have 30 seconds to turn around and walk out those doors before I remove you myself. He sneered, his upper lip curling into an arrogant smirk. You are going to remove me. Are you going to audit me to death, Pearl? I did not break eye contact. I simply raised my right hand and gave a small, precise nod. The response was immediate. Behind Todd, the two massive security guards who had been observing the escalating situation stepped forward. They moved with silent, coordinated efficiency. One guard placed a hand the size of a dinner plate firmly on Todd's right bicep. The other guard mirrored the action on his left side. "Sir, you need to vacate the premises immediately," the first guard stated. His voice was a low rumble of absolute authority. Todd's smirk vanished instantly. The arrogant tech founder persona dissolved, leaving behind a stunned, humiliated man. He tried to jerk his arm away, but the guard's grip was iron tight. "Get off me," Todd sputtered, his face flushing a deeper shade of crimson. "Pearl, tell them to let me go." "I am your family." "You are trespassing," I corrected. The guards did not wait for further debate. They physically rotated Todd and marched him toward the exit. He stumbled, struggling against their hold, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing against the pristine marble floor. The lobby watched in complete silence as the two men propelled him through the revolving glass doors and deposited him onto the rainy Seattle sidewalk. I stood in the center of the atrium, the ambient noise slowly returning as people went back to their morning routines. A few colleagues offered sympathetic nods. I smoothed the lapel of my blazer. The physical confrontation proved one vital point. Richard's power was geographically limited. He ruled the Bellevue Country Club. He controlled the narrative in the grocery store aisles and the golf course locker rooms. But outside of that suburban bubble, his threats held zero currency. I had just demonstrated that I controlled my own territory. I walked to the elevator bank, pressing the button for my floor. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a sharp, clear focus in its wake. Todd attacking me in public meant Richard was losing control of his proxies. The pressure of the subpoenas was fracturing the family hierarchy. If Todd was desperate enough to risk a physical altercation, it meant Elias Thorne had likely received his legal notice. The estate lawyer would be reviewing the demands right now, realizing the paper trail led directly to a $250,000 fraud. The elevator chimed its arrival. I stepped inside, leaning against the cool steel wall. The red herring had peaked and failed. The diversion was over. Richard had exhausted his social attacks and his physical intimidation tactics. He was cornered, and a cornered narcissist has only one remaining move. They attempt to use the very system they manipulated to crush their victim. By the end of the day, my father would make a catastrophic miscalculation. He would attempt to use the law against an auditor. He would open a door that could never be closed, setting the stage for his absolute ruin. The call from Sarah Sterling came on a Wednesday afternoon, exactly 48 hours after I had Todd removed from my lobby. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a complex tax variance when my phone vibrated. I answered, expecting an update on Elias Thorne. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of Sarah suppressing a triumphant laugh. "Pearl," she said, her voice practically vibrating with energy, "you need to come to my office right now. Your father just handed us the keys to his entire kingdom." I arrived at Sterling & Cole 20 minutes later. Sarah was standing behind her massive mahogany desk, holding a thin legal envelope. She did not ask me to sit. She simply slid the document across the polished wood. "Read it," she instructed. I picked up the papers. The header read, Superior Court of King County. It was a formal civil complaint. The plaintiff was Richard George. The defendant was Pearl George. I scanned the first page, my eyes catching the allegations. Breach of verbal contract. Unjust enrichment. Failure to honor familial financial obligations. At the bottom of the second page lay the demand, $312,000. He actually filed it? I whispered, tracing the sharp black ink. He sued me for the cost of my childhood. He did, Sarah confirmed, leaning forward, bracing her hands on the desk. He hired a strip mall litigator who specializes in aggressive demand letters to file a frivolous lawsuit. He assumes you will be so terrified of a public trial and the associated legal fees that you will settle immediately. It is a classic bully tactic. He wants to drag you into a deposition and browbeat you into writing a check to make the public embarrassment go away. I stared at the lawsuit. For a fleeting second, the old conditioning flared up. The deep ingrained fear of my father's authority, the terror of his disapproval. He was formally declaring war, utilizing the court system as his weapon. He was demanding a judge force me to pay him for the privilege of being his daughter. But then my analytical brain engaged, overriding the fear. I looked up at Sarah. Her dark eyes were bright, calculating, and utterly predatory. "He made a mistake," I said. Sarah smiled a sharp, wolfish grin. "He made a catastrophic error. By initiating a civil lawsuit, he just opened the door to legal discovery. He gave us full, uninhibited access to his financial life. We do not have to wait for Elias Thorne to respond to our initial probe anymore. We have a judge standing behind us." The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. In a civil lawsuit, both parties are entitled to demand evidence relevant to the claims. If Richard was suing me for unpaid financial obligations, I had the legal right to demand a full accounting of his own financial status to verify his claims. He thought he was throwing a punch, but he had just unlocked the vault. "What is our next move?" I asked. "I am filing a countersuit for fraud this afternoon," Sarah said, turning to her computer. "And attached to that countersuit will be the most aggressive, broad-scope discovery demand this firm has ever drafted. We are going to subpoena his personal bank accounts, his corporate ledgers, his tax returns, and all communication with Elias Thorne spanning the last 15 years. The next few days were a blur of intense legal preparation. I worked alongside Sarah's paralegals, cross-referencing the LLC data with my father's known real estate holdings. We built a comprehensive map of his financial ecosystem, identifying every potential pressure point. We drafted the subpoenas demanding every bank statement, every wire transfer receipt, every encrypted email related to the Shadow Corporation. On Friday afternoon, I was sitting in Sarah's conference room reviewing the final drafts when the paralegal walked in. He was carrying a massive stack of bound documents. The physical weight of the paperwork was staggering. It was hundreds of pages of legal demands meticulously formatted and stamped with the court seal. The paralegal approached the mahogany table. He dropped the stack. The heavy, satisfying thud echoed through the glass-walled room. The sound resonated in my chest, a physical manifestation of the trap snapping shut. This was not a bluff. This was a legal mandate. "They are being served to his attorney right now," Sarah said, looking at the towering stack of paper. "Richard is going to open that package, expecting a settlement offer. Instead, he is going to find a demand for 15 years of bank records." I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the documents. The irony was exquisite. My father, the man who viewed everyone as a subordinate, the man who believed he could control reality through sheer volume and intimidation, had just orchestrated his own audit. He had invited a forensic accountant to review his stolen empire. The weekend passed in a tense, silent waiting game. I knew Richard would not call me directly. The rules of engagement had shifted from social manipulation to active litigation. All communication had to flow through the attorneys. But I could imagine the scene in Bellevue. I could picture him pacing the hardwood floors of his study, his face flushed with rage, as his cheap litigator explained the scope of our discovery demands. I could see Helen clutching her cashmere cardigan, realizing the fake empire was about to be exposed to a judge. Monday morning brought the confirmation. Sarah called me just before lunch. Her tone was completely professional, masking the thrill underneath. "His lawyer just contacted my office," Sarah reported. "They are filing an emergency motion to quash the subpoenas. They claim our demands are overly broad and constitute harassment." "Will the judge grant it?" I asked, feeling a sudden spike of anxiety. Not a chance, Sarah replied confidently. Richard opened the door by filing the initial suit. A judge will not let him hide his finances while demanding yours. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. We are going to court, Pearl. The battleground was set. We were moving from the abstract realm of paperwork into the physical arena of a courtroom. Richard would try to use his presence, his tailored suits, and his booming voice to intimidate the judge. He would try to maintain the illusion of the successful patriarch. But he did not know what Sarah and I had waiting for him. He did not know that we were already digging deeper into the financial rot. Because while Sarah focused on fighting the motion to quash, I had spent the weekend running an independent trace on that mysterious $250,000 deposit from 2014. And what I found was about to change the entire trajectory of the war. Richard had not just stolen my identity to fund his golf trips. He had committed a crime so deeply personal, so breathtakingly cruel, that it would shatter the family hierarchy forever. The discovery phase was just beginning, and the ghost of my grandfather was about to testify. The judge did not even bother to retire to her chambers to review the motion to quash. She sat high on the bench in the King County Courthouse, adjusted her reading glasses, and systematically dismantled the arguments presented by Richard's cheap litigator. If a plaintiff initiates a lawsuit demanding financial compensation for raising a child, the judge reasoned the defense has every right to examine the plaintiff's financial history to establish the validity of the claim. The ruling took less than 10 minutes. The gavel fell. The court ordered full and immediate compliance with our discovery demands. By Thursday morning, the banker boxes arrived at the offices of Sterling & Cole. They were delivered on a hand truck by a nervous courier. 4 heavy cardboard boxes filled with the financial anatomy of my family. Sarah directed them into the glass-walled conference room. We ordered black coffee, closed the blinds to the Seattle skyline, and began the forensic autopsy. There is a distinct smell to subpoenaed financial records. It is a dry, sterile mixture of toner, ink, stale paper, and the underlying scent of panicked compliance. I sat at the mahogany table, pulling stacks of bank statements, tax returns, and property deeds from the cardboard boxes. Sarah sat across from me, cross-referencing the digital ledgers on her tablet. We were hunting for the origin of the $250,000 deposit that seeded the Shadow Corporation in 2014. To understand where the money came from, I had to look back at the one person in my family tree who saw through my father's fragile country club facade. My maternal grandfather, William. William was a retired pharmacist. He was a quiet, methodical man who lived in a modest brick house in Spokane. He spent his life counting pills, measuring doses, and observing human behavior from behind a pharmacy counter. He possessed a keen sense of character. Whenever he visited our Bellevue home, he would sit in the corner of the living room drinking cheap black tea while Richard boasted about his latest real estate acquisitions. William never argued with my father. He simply watched him with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating a bad investment. William passed away when I was 10 years old. I remembered the funeral as a blur of dark coats and rain. I remembered Richard complaining about the cost of the floral arrangements. What I did not know, what no one told me, was that William had visited a wealth management firm 3 weeks before his heart failed. I pulled a thick manila envelope from the third banker box. The return address belonged to the law offices of Elias Thorne. I unclasped the metal prongs and slid a bound legal document onto the table. The header read, Declaration of Irrevocable Trust. My breath caught in my throat. I traced my finger over the beneficiary line. It bore my name, Pearl George. Sarah looked up from her tablet, hearing the sharp intake of my breath. What did you find? She asked. The ghost, I whispered. I opened the document and read the stipulations. William had structured the trust with absolute precision. He placed $250,000 into an indexed account. The funds were locked, generating interest shielded from any external access. The trust was designed to mature and disperse directly to me on my 18th birthday. The designated purpose was explicit. The money was intended for my university tuition, a down payment on a first home, or the capitalization of a new business. It was a safety net. William knew Richard would eventually leverage my future to fund his own ego. My grandfather had reached across time to hand me an escape route, but I never received the money. I paid my own way through college, working 30 hours a week, managing the books for a local restaurant, while carrying a full course load. I took out student loans that took me 5 years to clear. I lived in a damp basement apartment, eating cheap pasta and wearing thrifted coats. I looked at the date of disbursement on the following page, June 2014, the exact month I turned 18, the exact month I graduated from high school. I turned the page to view the routing history. The money did not flow into my personal checking account. The document showed the entire balance plus accumulated interest being wired into a newly established commercial account. The destination was Pearl G. Holdings, LLC. "He stole my grandfather's gift," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. He intercepted the wire. Sarah stood up from her chair and walked around the table, looking over my shoulder at the routing numbers. Then she pulled up the corresponding transaction ledger for the shell company on her tablet. "Let us see what your tuition money bought," she said, her tone razor sharp. We matched the dates, tracing the flow of stolen capital as it washed through the fake LLC. The discoveries were sickening. 3 weeks after the trust was absorbed, Richard authorized a wire transfer for $80,000 to a marine brokerage in Kirkland. He bought a luxury cabin cruiser. He named it the Sea Level. I remembered standing on the deck of that boat during a summer party, listening to him brag to his country club friends about his savvy investment strategies. I kept tracing the ledger. 2 years later, another massive withdrawal appeared. $65,000 paid directly to a premier event planning agency and an exclusive catering firm. I felt a cold, heavy weight settle in my stomach. That was the exact cost of Clara's wedding. My sister had walked down the aisle in a custom-imported gown, flanked by towering displays of white orchids and imported roses. She danced under crystal chandeliers, believing her father was a generous titan of industry. Todd had toasted his new father-in-law, praising his boundless generosity. None of them knew the truth. Clara had celebrated her flawless golden child milestone using the stolen financial foundation of her older sister. Richard had financed his favorite daughter's wedding by liquidating my future. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Richard did not just view me as a subordinate employee. He viewed me as a harvestable asset. He took the only piece of unconditional love I had ever been given and turned it into a boat and a party. I turned back to the stack of legal papers. A transfer of this magnitude required authorization. An irrevocable trust cannot be redirected without the explicit legal consent of the beneficiary. I found the release authorization buried near the bottom of the envelope. It was a single sheet of heavy stock paper covered in dense legal jargon, terminating my rights to the indexed account and assigning the disbursement to the LLC. I stared closely at the bottom of the page, the signature line. My name was written there, Pearl George. I leaned in, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. My eyes traced the curvature of the letters. The signature was a clever imitation, but it lacked the fluid muscle memory of my own hand. The loops on the P's and the G's were too sharp, too aggressive. They mirrored the rigid, forward-leaning penmanship of someone who is accustomed to signing dictation. But it was not just the shape of the letters that caught my attention. It was the ink. It was not standard black printer ink or standard blue ballpoint. It was a highly specific, saturated shade, a deep, striking blue-black. The sensory memory transported me back to the high-end steakhouse in Bellevue. I was sitting across from my father, watching him fold his hands over his empty rocks glass. I remembered the distinct, sharp scratch of his pen against the heavy cardstock of the dinner receipt. I remembered the flash of the silver clip. It was a custom Mont Blanc pen. He carried it in the breast pocket of every suit he owned. He used that specific blue-black ink for all his high-level contracts. He considered it his executive signature. He signed it, "I stated," pointing at the ink. He forged my name using his own custom pen. Sarah leaned down, inspecting the ink color. She nodded slowly, a grim smile spreading across her face. It is a rookie mistake, born of pure arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. But look right below the signature line, Pearl. Look at who validated the forgery. I shifted my gaze downward. A circular notary stamp was pressed into the paper, verifying that the signature had been witnessed and authenticated. Across the stamp, a familiar signature was scrawled: Elias Thorne. The estate lawyer had not just drafted the paperwork, he had actively participated in the fraud. He applied his official notary seal to a forged document facilitating the theft of $250,000 from an 18-year-old girl. Elias Thorne is an officer of the court, Sarah said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, predatory cadence. By notarizing a forged release, he committed a severe felony. He risked his license, his practice, and his freedom to help your father buy a yacht. The weak link in the chain had just revealed itself. Richard was a narcissist who would never admit defeat. He would burn his own house down before he surrendered. But Elias Thorne was a country club lawyer accustomed to easy billable hours and comfortable lunches. He was not a hardened criminal. If we threatened to hand this forged document over to the State Bar Association and the federal prosecutors, Elias would not protect my father. He would panic. "We are not waiting for the mediation session," Sarah announced, turning back to her computer. "I am calling Thorne's office right now. We are dragging him into a deposition. We are going to put him in a room, show him this blue-black ink, and offer him one chance to save his own skin." I looked back down at the forged signature. The anger inside me had distilled into something pure and highly concentrated. Richard had sent me an invoice for my childhood, trying to extract $300,000 to cover up the exact amount he had stolen from me. He thought the audit was over. He had no idea I was about to depose his chief architect and turn his most trusted advisor into the weapon that would bring his fake empire crashing to the ground. The deposition room at Sterling & Cole was intentionally designed to make people uncomfortable. The walls were painted a stark institutional white. The lighting overhead consisted of harsh fluorescent panels that buzzed with a faint electric hum, casting unflattering shadows across the faces of anyone sitting at the long glass table. There were no windows to offer a view of the Seattle skyline. It was a room built for extraction. Elias Thorne arrived at 9 o'clock precisely. He wore a charcoal pinstripe suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders and a silk tie patterned in muted gold. He carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive but worn at the edges. He sat opposite me, his posture rigid, projecting the false confidence of a man who believed his law degree made him immune to consequence. His attorney, a younger associate from his own firm, sat beside him, looking pale and deeply out of his depth. Sarah Sterling took the head of the table. I sat to her right. The court reporter positioned in the corner began tapping her machine, recording the date, the time, and the identities of everyone present. Mr. Thorne. Sarah began, her voice flat and devoid of professional courtesy. "You are here pursuant to a subpoena duces tecum regarding your role in the establishment and management of Pearl G Holdings, LLC. Elias offered a tight, patronizing smile. "I am fully aware of why I am here, Ms. Sterling. However, I must remind you that my interactions with Richard George are protected by attorney-client privilege. I will not be answering any questions that violate that confidentiality." Sarah did not blink. Privilege does not protect the commission of a crime, Elias. She reached for the black presentation binder resting in front of her. She opened it and removed a single document encased in a clear plastic sleeve. It was the trust release authorization. The document that transferred $250,000 from my grandfather to my father. She slid it across the glass table. It stopped precisely in front of Elias. "Do you recognize this document?" Sarah asked. Elias barely glanced at it. "It appears to be a standard trust disbursement release," he said, adopting a tone of profound boredom. "I draft dozens of these a year." "Is that your notary stamp at the bottom of the page?" Sarah inquired. Elias adjusted his silk tie. "It is." And you authenticated the signature of Pearl George on June 12, 2014, verifying her consent to transfer the contents of her irrevocable trust to the LLC. I did, Elias confirmed. His younger associate shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent. Sarah leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table. That is fascinating, Elias. Because on June 12, 2014, Pearl George was sitting in the gymnasium of Bellevue High School attending her graduation ceremony. She was surrounded by 300 classmates and faculty members. She did not visit your office. She did not sign this document. Elias's patronizing smile faltered. His eyes flicked down to the plastic sleeve. Perhaps the date is a clerical error. Sometimes paperwork is backdated for administrative convenience. It is not an administrative error, Elias Sarah countered, her voice dropping into a dangerous, predatory register. It is a Class C felony. She pulled a second document from her binder and slid it across the table, aligning it perfectly beside the first. It was a blown-up, high-resolution photograph of the signature block. We had this document analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert, Sarah explained. The loops on the letters are inconsistent with my client's known exemplars. The pressure points indicate a deliberate tracing motion. Furthermore, the ink utilized is a highly specific blue-black blend. It matches the exact proprietary ink cartridge used in the Montblanc pen that your client, Richard George, carries in his breast pocket every single day. The silence in the room became absolute. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The court reporter paused, her typing hands hovering over the keys. Elias Thorne stared at the enlarged photograph. I watched a bead of sweat form near his hairline, tracing a slow path down his temple. His breathing grew shallow. The false confidence evaporated, replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of his situation. He was an officer of the court caught notarizing a forged signature to facilitate a massive financial theft. You notarized a forgery, Sarah stated, delivering the fatal blow. You actively participated in a conspiracy to defraud an 18-year-old girl of her inheritance. I have already drafted the complaint for the Washington State Bar Association. I have also prepared a referral package for the United States Attorney's Office detailing multiple counts of wire fraud. Elias swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his stiff, white collar. His hands resting on the table began to tremble. If you attempt to protect Richard George today, Sarah continued, I will file these complaints before you reach the elevator. You will be disbarred. You will face federal indictment. You will lose your practice, your pension, and your freedom. However, if you choose to cooperate fully right now, I will hold the bar complaint in abeyance pending the resolution of this civil matter. The younger associate beside Elias leaned over, whispering frantically into his ear. Elias waved him off, a gesture of pure desperation. He looked at the forged signature, then up at Sarah. He did not look at me. I did not forge it, he croaked, his voice cracking. He reached a trembling hand toward the plastic sleeve. He pushed the original document back across the table, as if trying to distance himself from the crime. I just stamped it. I did not write the name. We know you did not write it, Sarah said smoothly. We know Richard George forged the signature using his pen. We just need you to testify to that fact on the record. Elias shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion. The sweat was now visible on his upper lip. No, he stammered, you do not understand. Richard did not sign it either. Sarah frowned, a slight furrow appearing between her brows. Explain. Richard is too careful, Elias breathed, his hands shaking uncontrollably against the glass table. He is obsessed with deniability. He wanted the money to capitalize the LLC, but he refused to commit the physical felony himself. He told me his pride would not allow him to forge his own daughter's name. He said it was beneath him. Then who signed it? I demanded, my voice echoing harshly in the sterile room. Elias finally raised his eyes and met my gaze. The fear in his expression was genuine, unvarnished terror. Your mother, he whispered. The room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights faded into a distant, hollow ringing. Helen George signed it. Elias confessed, the words spilling out of him rapidly. We were all in Richard's study at the Bellevue house. Richard handed her his Mont Blanc pen. He told her they needed the cash to maintain their social standing. He told her it was the only way to save the country club membership. She did not argue. She took the pen, traced your signature, and handed the document back to me. She forged it, Pearl. Your mother stole your trust fund. I sat frozen, staring at the sweating, terrified lawyer across the table. The revelation shattered the final remaining illusion of my family dynamic. For 30 years, I had viewed Richard as the tyrant and Helen as the helpless enabler. I believed she was trapped in his orbit, a victim of his aggressive control. But Elias Thorne had just rewritten the entire narrative. Richard George did not force my mother's hand. He simply handed her the tool. Helen chose to wield it. She chose her cashmere sweaters, her tennis matches, and her curated society image over the financial security of her own child. She was not a victim caught in the crossfire. She was the architect of my ruin. She was the one who physically executed the theft. Sarah Sterling remained perfectly composed. She leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto Elias. "Are you prepared to testify to these events under oath in open court?" she asked. "I will testify to whatever you need," Elias gasped, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of a trembling hand. "Just do not send the file to the federal prosecutor." The deposition concluded 20 minutes later. We secured Elias' sworn statement detailing the forgery, the creation of the Shadow LLC, and the subsequent misappropriation of the trust funds. He signed the transcript with a shaking hand and practically bolted from the room, his young associate trailing behind him. I remained seated at the glass table. Sarah gathered the documents, sliding them back into her binder. "Well," Sarah remarked, her tone clinically detached, "that changes our leverage significantly." I looked up at her, the shock slowly morphing into a cold, absolute clarity. "Richard thinks he can still bully us in the upcoming mediation session," I said, my voice steady. "He thinks he can use his deep voice and his tailored suits to force a settlement. He does not know we have Elias. He does not know we have the truth about Helen." Sarah snapped the binder shut. "Tomorrow morning we sit down with them. We let Richard bluster. We let him demand his $300,000, and then we drop the guillotine." I stood up, gathering my leather tote. The profound betrayal of my mother should have broken me. It should have sent me spiraling back into the old familiar conditioning. But the pain was absent. The emotional umbilical cord connecting me to the Bellevue house had finally been severed completely. I was no longer a daughter fighting her parents. I was an auditor, finalizing a hostile takeover. The trap was fully set, and Richard George was about to walk blindly right into the center of it. The Mediation Center occupied the 14th floor of a sterile concrete building in downtown Seattle. It was a space designed for compromise, meaning it lacked any trace of comfort or warmth. The walls were painted in institutional beige. The oval table dominating the center of the room was constructed of cheap imitation wood. There were no windows to offer distraction, just a digital clock counting down the seconds of our scheduled 2-hour session. I sat on one side with Sarah Sterling. We arrived 15 minutes early, arranging our limited paperwork in neat, deliberate stacks. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy oak door swung open. Richard George walked in. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, the kind designed to project authority and intimidate subordinates. His posture was rigid, his chest puffed out like a general inspecting a conquered territory. He did not look like a man facing federal indictments. He looked like a man expecting an apology. Helen followed half a step behind him. She wore a tailored beige trench coat tightly belted at the waist, holding a designer handbag against her stomach like a shield. Her eyes darted around the windowless room, avoiding my gaze entirely. Their legal representation trailed behind them. Richard had hired a strip mall litigator named Gregory Finch. Finch carried a scuffed synthetic leather briefcase and wore a suit that was a full size too large. He looked tired. He looked like a man who billed by the hour and survived on intimidation tactics that rarely reached a courtroom. They took their seats across from us. The court-appointed mediator, a quiet older man with wire-rimmed glasses, sat at the head of the table. He recited the standard preamble, reminding us that the goal today was to reach a mutually agreeable settlement and avoid the cost of a public trial. When the mediator finished, Gregory Finch did not waste a single second. He leaned forward, flipping open a legal pad with practiced theatricality. "My client is willing to be reasonable today." Finch began, his voice carrying a forced booming quality. "We understand that family disputes are highly emotional. However, the facts remain undeniable. Ms. George received extensive financial support well beyond the legal age of majority. We have itemized ledgers proving a total expenditure of $312,000. My client is prepared to accept a structured settlement of $200,000 today to drop the civil suit. If we do not secure an agreement, we are fully prepared to litigate this matter in open court." The demand hung in the stale air of the boardroom. Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his broad chest. A smug, satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. He was playing his favorite role, the benevolent dictator offering a discount to a rebellious subject. He truly believed he was holding all the cards. He thought the threat of a public trial, the fear of exposure, would force me to write a check just to make the nightmare disappear. I did not respond to Finch. I shifted my attention to Helen. My mother sat frozen next to her husband. She reached forward and picked up a generic plastic cup filled with ice water. Her hands were visibly shaking. As she held the cup, her long acrylic nail began to strike the thin plastic side. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic, frantic sound echoed in the quiet room. It was a sharp staccato beat of pure, hidden terror. She knew what she had done in that study 10 years ago. She knew she had forged my signature. Her nervous tapping stood in stark contrast to Richard's puffed-out chest and arrogant certainty. She was a woman waiting for the ground to open up and swallow her whole. Sarah Sterling sat beside me perfectly still. She did not open her binder. She did not counter the offer. She remained entirely silent, letting the empty space stretch out. That was our agreed strategy. Sarah was the legal architect, but this was a family execution. I needed to be the one to lower the blade. "Your silence is not a legal defense." Pearl Richards spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. He uncrossed his arms and placed his hands flat on the imitation wood table. "You think you can ignore this away? You think hiring a high-priced downtown lawyer makes you untouchable. Let me clarify your reality. If we go to trial, I will subpoena your employers. I will drag your colleagues into court. I will expose your erratic behavior and have your certified public accountant license reviewed for moral turpitude. I will destroy your career before I let you walk away from your debts." He was threatening the only thing I had built for myself. He wanted to burn my professional reputation to the ground, using the very smear campaign he had orchestrated in Bellevue as evidence of my instability. I looked at the man who had monetized my childhood. I observed his tailored suit, his expensive watch, his custom blue-black pen tucked neatly into his breast pocket. He was a master of the bluff, relying on volume and threats to control his environment. What Richard did not know was that 48 hours ago, Sarah and I had drafted a comprehensive package. We included the forged trust documents, the commercial ledger from Pearl G. Holdings, and the sworn deposition transcript from Elias Thorne. We did not send that package to the civil court. We routed it directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Agents were already reviewing his tax evasion and corporate wire fraud. He was sitting in a mediation room threatening my accounting license, while federal investigators were currently dissecting his fake empire. I let him enjoy his smug certainty for one more long, agonizing minute. I listened to the frantic tapping of Helen's acrylic nail against the water glass. The sound grew faster, a desperate metronome counting down the final seconds of their luxurious lie. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on the black presentation binder resting in front of me. The plastic cover felt cool under my fingertips. I looked directly into my father's eyes, stripping away 30 years of obedience, fear, and compliance. I was no longer the daughter desperate for his approval. I was the consequence he never saw coming. I flipped the binder open. The crisp, white pages inside contained the exact blueprint of his destruction. The time for mediation was officially over. It was time to show Richard George what a real audit looked like. I flipped the heavy black cover open. The crisp white pages resting inside represented the culmination of a lifelong audit. I did not look at Gregory Finch, the cheap litigator hired to bully me. I addressed the architect of my misery directly. The demand for $300,000 is formally rejected, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute finality against the barren walls. Furthermore, I am officially withdrawing my initial counter-invoice. The emotional damage you inflicted is no longer the currency we are trading today. Richard scoffed a harsh, dismissive sound, but his eyes betrayed a sudden flicker of uncertainty. He adjusted his silk tie, attempting to project dominance. "You are wasting my time, Pearl," he growled. I slid the first piece of evidence across the imitation wood surface. It was the Irrevocable Trust Declaration, drafted by my late grandfather. The patriarch glanced down at the paper. His arrogant posture shattered instantly. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pale, sickly complexion. The illusion of his invincibility began to dissolve right before my eyes. Next, I pushed the release authorization forward, the document bearing the forged signature. The rhythmic, frantic tapping of my mother's acrylic nail ceased immediately. The silence that replaced it was suffocating. "You did not just appropriate $250,000, I continued, keeping my tone completely devoid of mercy. You committed grand larceny. You engaged in systematic tax evasion by washing untaxed capital through a shadow corporation. And you orchestrated federal wire fraud." Finch tried to intervene. He sputtered a warning about baseless accusations and defamation. Sarah silenced him with a single raised hand. She withdrew the sworn deposition transcript provided by Elias Thorne and pushed it toward the strip mall lawyer. "Your esteemed estate planner flipped." Sarah explained her delivery surgical and precise. He confessed to notarizing a fraudulent document. He also confirmed exactly who held the pen. Finch skimmed the first page of the transcript. His eyes widened. He closed his legal pad, snapped his synthetic leather briefcase shut, and leaned back in his chair. He was legally detaching himself from a sinking ship. He knew his clients were no longer facing a family dispute. They were facing federal prison. I turned my gaze toward Helen. She was shrinking into her beige trench coat, resembling a terrified animal caught in a steel snare. "I know you forged my name," I said to her. "I know you traded my future for a country club membership and a pristine society image." Helen let out a ragged, wet sob. She reached a trembling hand across the table, her eyes pleading for a mercy she had never shown me. "Pearl, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. We were desperate. "You have to understand the immense pressure we were under to maintain appearances. "Do not touch me," I commanded, the sheer coldness of my voice freezing her hand in midair. "You lost the right to ask for my understanding the day you signed away my inheritance to buy a luxury yacht." Richard attempted to speak. His jaw worked frantically, but no sound emerged. The booming, authoritarian baritone he utilized to command boardrooms had completely evaporated. He looked remarkably small sitting in that cheap plastic chair, stripped of his wealth and his manufactured authority. "We are not negotiating a settlement today," I declared. "We are finalizing your surrender." 48 hours ago, my legal team routed a heavily redacted preliminary summary of your Shadow LLC to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. They are currently opening an active file. The mediator, sitting at the head of the table, pushed his chair back slightly, physically distancing himself from the impending criminal fallout. He recognized that this session had transformed from a civil mediation into a crime scene revelation. I calculated the exact figure I stated, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the defeated patriarch. 250,000 principal, compounded annually at a conservative market index rate over 10 years, yields exactly $409,000. Adding the exorbitant legal fees you forced me to incur brings the total demand to nearly $500,000. You are entirely insolvent. Your commercial accounts are currently defaulting, and you lack the liquid capital to write a check. Therefore, your physical properties are the only acceptable currency. If you want me to withhold the unredacted evidence, the original physical forgery and Elias Thorne's signed confession, you will provide full restitution today, I outlined. Sarah produced a final, thick stack of paper, setting it squarely in the center of the table. It was a binding, irrevocable property transfer agreement. It mandated the immediate forfeiture of the cabin cruiser, known as the Sea Level. It also required the total transfer of all remaining equity in the Bellevue estate directly to my legal trust. Richard stared at the transfer agreement. He was a man watching his entire fabricated reality burn to ash. He was losing his wealth, his status, and his home in a single devastating stroke. His fake empire was being dismantled, brick by brick, by the very daughter he thought he could intimidate. If you do not execute this document, Sarah added, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, the IRS receives the unredacted files in exactly 15 minutes. You will both be federally indicted before the weekend. The authorities will seize your assets anyway, but you will be navigating the process from a jail cell. The silence in the room was absolute. There were no more threats to levy. There were no more social smears to deploy. The country club could not save them now. Their reputation was worthless inside this sterile, concrete room. Richard reached slowly into his tailored breast pocket. His fingers were physically trembling. He pulled out the custom blue-black Mont Blanc pen. It was the exact instrument he had handed his wife 10 years ago to commit a felony. Now it was the tool of his own demise. He uncapped it, his hand shaking so violently the metal clip rattled against the barrel. He pressed the premium nib to the paper and signed away his fake empire to stay out of a federal penitentiary. The ink flowed onto the signature line, a dark, permanent stain, finalizing his ruin. The scratch of the nib echoed loudly, mirroring the exact sound that had initiated this war during my birthday dinner. He flipped to the next page and signed again. The boat was gone. He flipped to the third page. The house equity was transferred. The audit was complete. The ink from the blue-black Mont Blanc pen dried quickly on the heavy legal paper, finalizing the transfer of the George family empire. The mediation session ended not with a handshake, but with a hasty, terrified retreat. Richard and Helen practically fled the sterile concrete room, leaving their strip mall litigator behind to gather his synthetic leather briefcase in silence. The threat of federal indictment had broken them completely. They surrendered their physical assets to shield themselves from a criminal prosecution they could never survive. The transition of power was swift and devastating. Within 48 hours, Sarah Sterling executed the property transfer agreements. The cabin cruiser named the Sea Level was officially repossessed by a maritime holding company I established. It was sold at auction 3 weeks later to a tech executive who rebranded it and moved it to a private marina in Kirkland. I did not keep a single cent from the sale. I routed the proceeds directly into an index fund, replenishing the exact principal my grandfather had intended for my future. The Bellevue estate, the crown jewel of Richard's fabricated identity, took slightly longer to dismantle. The property was heavily leveraged, carrying 2 mortgages and a line of credit he had opened using the Shadow LLC. We initiated a forced sale, liquidating the remaining equity. Richard and Helen were given 30 days to vacate the premises. The social fallout was immediate and absolute. The country club ecosystem is a predatory environment that detects weakness like blood in the water. The moment the Bellevue property was listed for a distressed sale, the rumors shifted. The narrative Richard had so carefully constructed, painting me as an unstable, greedy daughter, evaporated overnight. The truth leaked through the grapevine. The community realized Richard was not a wealthy patriarch enduring a family tragedy. He was a bankrupt fraud who had forged his own wife's signature to steal his child's inheritance. Sylvia Caldwell, the woman I had encountered in the grocery store dairy aisle, was the first to sever ties. She publicly rescinded Helen's invitation to co-chair the annual hospital gala, citing a sudden change in committee direction. The rest of the society wives followed suit. Helen was unceremoniously dropped from her tennis leagues, her book clubs, and her weekly spa appointments. They did not confront her. They simply stopped returning her calls, treating her with a polite, freezing distance that was far more punishing than anger. She became a ghost haunting the very social circles she had sacrificed my future to maintain. The financial collapse triggered a chain reaction, severing the remaining branches of the family tree. Without Richard's stolen credit lines to float his failing startup, Todd was forced to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy. His tech company folded, laying off its junior developers and vacating its leased downtown office space. The luxurious Medina house he shared with Clara was foreclosed upon by the primary lender. The golden child was finally forced to face the reality of the adult world without a safety net. Clara called me once during the eviction process. Her voice was thin, lacking the usual shrill entitlement. She did not yell. She did not demand that I fix the situation. She sounded completely lost, adrift in a reality she had never been prepared to navigate. She asked if she could borrow $10,000 for a security deposit on a rental apartment. I told her I was an auditor, not a bank. I reminded her that the designer handbag she clutched during her last visit to my apartment could easily cover first and last month's rent if she consigned it. I hung up the phone, feeling no guilt. Shielding her from consequence would only enable the very dependency that Richard had cultivated. A month later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Clara had taken a job. She was working as a barista at a chain coffee shop in Redmond, wearing a green apron and serving lattes to the same tech executives her husband used to pitch for venture capital. She was learning the value of $1 the hard way, standing on her feet for 8 hours a day. It was not a punishment. It was a mandatory education. As the autumn rain began to wash over Seattle, signaling the change of seasons, I received a notification from the title company. The sale of the Bellevue estate had officially closed. The keys were transferred to the new owners. The George family was entirely gone from the neighborhood. I decided to take a drive on a quiet Sunday morning. I navigated my Volvo across the 520 bridge, taking the familiar curving roads through the wealthy suburbs. The trees were turning vibrant shades of gold and crimson, shedding their leaves onto the wet pavement. I turned onto the familiar cul-de-sac and slowed the car to a crawl. The sprawling 2-story house sat behind a wrought iron gate. It looked different. The pristine, manicured lawn that Richard used to obsess over was overgrown, the grass thick and unruly. The seasonal flower beds Helen used to micromanage were filled with weeds. The massive oak front doors were shut tight, stripped of the seasonal wreaths she always hung to signal her status. I parked the car against the curb and turned off the engine. I sat in the silence, looking at the structure that had defined my childhood. This was the place where I had learned to shrink, to apologize, to measure my worth by my ability to comply with unreasonable demands. This was the boardroom where Richard had ruled and Helen had enabled. I expected a rush of emotion. I braced myself for the lingering anger over the stolen trust fund, or the deep sorrow of realizing my parents never truly loved me. I waited for the trauma bond to flare up, demanding closure. But as I stared at the overgrown lawn, I felt absolutely nothing. The house was just wood and brick. The people who lived there were just strangers who shared my DNA. The power they held over me was an illusion, built on forged documents and country club gossip. I had audited their entire existence and found it completely bankrupt. There was no victory lap. There was no cinematic confrontation where they tearfully begged for my forgiveness. Real accountability does not offer apologies. It offers clarity. I reached forward and started the engine. The Volvo purred to life. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, merging back onto the main road toward Seattle. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I left the empty kingdom behind, focusing on the open highway ahead. The financial war was over, but the true victory was not the recovered money or the dismantled empire. The true victory was the profound quiet that now occupied my mind. I was ready to build a life that did not require an invoice. 6 months passed since the day the George family empire was formally dismantled. The winter storms had finally cleared, giving way to a crisp, bright Seattle spring. I woke up at 6 in the morning, not because of a frantic text message or a looming deadline, but because the sunlight was hitting the large windows of my new apartment. I lived on the top floor of a converted warehouse in Pioneer Square. The space was open, the brick walls exposed, and the ceilings high. There were no country club restrictions on the paint colors and no expectations of curated perfection. It was just a space that belonged entirely to me. I walked into the kitchen tying the belt of my robe and turned on the espresso machine. The mechanical hum and the scent of freshly ground dark roast coffee filled the air. I poured the dark liquid into a heavy ceramic mug, adding a single cube of sugar. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, wrapping both hands around the warm mug, and looked out over the Puget Sound. The water was a deep, churning blue dotted with the white wakes of early morning ferries cutting across the bay. The city was waking up, but the frantic energy of my past felt miles away. The silence in my apartment was profound. It was not the tense, loaded silence that used to follow one of Richard's lectures. It was the peaceful quiet of an unbilled life. I had used the exact $250,000 recovered from the sale of the Sea Level to capitalize a new venture. I resigned from my position at the corporate accounting firm the week the Bellevue house was sold. I rented a small office space downtown and opened my own independent forensic auditing firm. I specialized exclusively in domestic financial abuse. I spent my days helping spouses who had been financially isolated and adult children whose credit had been hijacked by predatory parents. I took the skills I learned surviving Richard George and weaponized them to protect people who were trapped in the exact same cages. I no longer ironed napkins or apologized for breathing. I hunted ghosts for a living. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground me. It is a strange realization to finally understand the mechanics of a toxic family. They operate exactly like bad debt. They attach themselves to your ledger, drawing heavily against your emotional and financial capital, while simultaneously demanding that you thank them for the privilege of being drained. They convince you that the crushing weight you carry is actually a gift. If you are listening to this right now and you recognize that weight, I need you to understand something vital. You do not owe anyone your future just because they happen to provide your past. Love is not an invoice. Family is not a corporate hierarchy where you are the unpaid intern. If someone hands you a bill for their conditional affection, you have every right to audit the account. You might discover, as I did, that they have been morally and financially bankrupt all along. The legal fallout for Richard and Helen was a slow, grinding humiliation. The Internal Revenue Service did not offer them a mediation session. The federal agents arrived at their new small rental apartment unannounced, seizing hard drives and financial ledgers. The criminal investigation was ongoing, but the immediate financial penalties were staggering. The IRS levied massive fines for the tax evasion associated with Pearl G. Holdings. The penalty wiped out whatever meager cash reserves Richard had managed to hide. Elias Thorne, true to form, threw them entirely under the bus. He surrendered his law license and cooperated fully with the federal prosecutors, ensuring he avoided prison time by testifying against his former clients. But the most poetic justice was not the legal fees or the loss of the estate. It was the absolute destruction of Richard's public identity. To satisfy the monthly payment plan mandated by the IRS, Richard was forced to secure immediate employment. His commercial real estate firm had collapsed following the exposure of his fraud. No reputable agency in Bellevue would hire a man under active federal investigation for wire fraud. He found a job because he had no other choice. Last Tuesday, I was driving back from a client meeting on the east side when the traffic backed up near the entrance of the Bellevue Country Club. I was stopped at a red light directly across from the heavy wrought iron gates. The same gates my father used to drive through in his luxury SUV, waving to the security guards like he owned the pavement. The weather was miserable. A cold, sharp Washington rain was falling sideways, soaking the manicured landscaping. Through the blur of the windshield wipers, I saw a figure standing under the small canvas awning of the valet stand. It was Richard. He was wearing the standard valet uniform, a cheap synthetic black jacket and a poorly fitted polo shirt bearing the country club crest. The man who used to demand $300,000 for the crime of raising me was currently earning minimum wage plus tips. As I watched a sleek silver Mercedes pulled up to the curb, it was driven by a senior partner from a local wealth management firm, a man who used to attend Richard's lavish dinner parties and smoke expensive cigars in his study. Richard stepped out from under the awning into the freezing rain. He did not look like a CEO. He looked diminished, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. He opened the door of the Mercedes, standing silently in the downpour, while his former peer handed him a crumpled $5 bill and the keys. Richard took the money without making eye contact, his head bowed in forced submission. He slid into the driver's seat of the car he used to own, closing the door on the rain. The light turned green. I took my foot off the brake and accelerated away from the country club. I did not feel a surge of vindictive joy. I did not roll down the window and shout. The sight of him, standing in the cold rain fetching cars for the people who used to admire him, was simply the logical conclusion of his own audit. The ledger was finally balanced. I turned my attention back to the present moment, looking out at the ferry crossing the Puget Sound. My phone, resting on the kitchen counter, was completely silent. There were no frantic voicemails from Helen. There were no demands from Clara. There were no legal threats from my father. I set my ceramic mug in the sink and walked toward the front door, grabbing my coat and my briefcase. I had a 9 o'clock meeting with a new client, a woman whose husband had secretly opened 4 credit cards in her name to fund a gambling habit. She was terrified, overwhelmed, and convinced she had no way out. I smiled, opening my front door and stepping out into the bright Seattle morning. She did not know it yet, but she had come to the right place. I was going to show her exactly how to burn a fake empire to the ground. The first time I truly understood the cost of my childhood, it wasn't through a memory of a harsh word or a slammed door. It was when my father slid a $312,000 invoice across a white tablecloth on my 30th birthday, itemizing every meal, every roof, every breath I took under his care. He called it a return on investment, a chilling phrase that stripped away every illusion I had about the meaning of family. In American culture, we are often taught that the family is a sanctuary, a foundation built on unconditional support and shared values. We celebrate the sacrifices parents make, the long hours worked, the dreams deferred to provide a better life for the next generation. But what happens when that sacrifice is weaponized? What happens when the home is run not like a haven, but like a corporate hierarchy, where children are viewed not as human beings, but as capital investments expected to yield a dividend? My father, Richard, built his identity on an empire of appearances. He was terrified of the poverty his own father had fallen into, and so he clawed his way into Bellevue society, desperate to prove his worth through country club memberships and luxury cars. But to maintain that facade, he required constant tribute. He demanded absolute loyalty, enforcing it through what I now recognize as financial terror. My mother, Helen, became his complicit enabler, the vice president of public relations who smoothed over his cruelty, calling it discipline, and prioritizing her cashmere sweaters over my financial future. She traded her protective instincts for the comfort of a wealthy zip code, ultimately betraying me in the most profound way by forging my signature to steal my inheritance. For years, I was conditioned to apologize, to keep the peace, to absorb their debts and save their reputations. It was a trauma bond that wired my nervous system to shrink, to believe that I owed them my future to pay for my past. I learned the hard way that toxic families operate like bad debt. They drain your emotional and financial capital while demanding you thank them for the privilege of being drained. Parenting is not a transaction. Love is not an invoice. When we raise children, our responsibility is to guide them, to equip them with the tools they need to navigate the world with integrity and resilience. It is not our right to harvest their potential or mortgage their futures to fund our own egos. The true measure of a family is not the status they project to the world, but the honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness they cultivate within their own walls. My survival began when I realized that true loyalty must be earned, not extorted. It began when I used my professional skills as an auditor to dismantle the fake empire my parents had built on a foundation of lies and stolen funds. I learned that sometimes the healthiest outcome isn't forgiveness or a cinematic apology. It's the cold, clear light of accountability. It's the strength to walk away from the table, to leave the empty kingdom behind, and to build a life that doesn't require an invoice. We must ask ourselves what legacy we are truly leaving our children. Are we building them up, or are we quietly adding up their debts? If you found yourself nodding along, if you've ever had to audit the cost of someone's conditional love, I want you to know you aren't alone. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, please subscribe to Savage Revenge Stories, like this video, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. We spend our lives trying to balance the books of our past, hoping that one day the accounts will settle. But perhaps the ultimate truth of adulthood isn't about paying off what we supposedly owe our parents. Perhaps true maturity is simply realizing that the invoice was fraudulent to begin with, and that the only debt we ever truly owe is to the person we are struggling to become.